one. So today what we will do, you see, I think this lecture, I'll tell you what the genesis of this lecture series is. Okay. You see, over the last few years, uh, there has been general discontent about the kind of economics that we teach in most universities around the world. Okay, especially after the Cold War, in 80s and 90s, uh, economics that is taught in universities and colleges began to be only one kind of economics. That is the standard neoclassical economics, which has a certain way of looking at the world. Okay, but so basically, what we will do in this class is we'll see why we are unhappy about that, right? Or in general, I'll take you through the general discontent that is there about the way we teach economics. Then what we will try to cover in this and the next class is basically a very, very quick review of what the alternative schools of economics are, and then we will start to look in detail over the next few lectures on what each of these different approaches are. So basically, to start with, we will learn to understand what are the different approaches to thinking about economics. Uh, you know, uh, Instead of the one and the only one approach that is taught to us in schools and colleges, what are the strengths and weaknesses of each? And then basically, so point is to understand that economics is a way of thinking about the world, and there's just not one way of thinking about the world. There are different ways of thinking about the world, and each of them have their own strengths and weaknesses. I'm saying this particularly because if you look at, say, a book like Mankey, which is a textbook which is used everywhere, right? And if you look at its first chapter or second chapter, Thinking Like an Economist, then thinking like an economist there essentially is all about thinking in a neoclassical manner, right? Whereas I think whereas an economist, being an economist really requires you to have different ways of thinking. So instead of having this one large sledgehammer of neoclassical mathematical like modeling, you need to have actually a toolbox of, because Marxist economists think of it differently, behavioral economists think of it differently, feminist economists think of it differently. Of economic problem as a different approach to understanding things. Yeah. So basically, we need to bring together all these approaches as toolboxes and use them in an eclectic fashion to deal with the problems that we face. And I think that's the whole idea of this course. The reason I'm teaching this course, I thought of doing it online, is because there is no university or college which is going to actually give a holistic view of give a view of the plural approaches to economics. Right, because they have to do with certain syllabi, and on certain syllabi have to be mainstream textbooks. So what has happened is colleges only end up teaching what is mainstream microeconomics, which is generally accepted everywhere, right? But we didn't help us so much in terms of being able to address a variety of problems. So you see, I'll first start with a letter by 1,000 French students in Le Mans in 17 June 2000, which says, "We economic students of the world declare ourselves to be generally dissatisfied with the teaching that we receive. We wish to escape from the imaginary worlds." Yeah, so I'm sure that is also the kind of feeling that many economists, many students in our universities and colleges get when we learn economics. Especially after the 2008 crisis, a group of students came together, and so I'm in a lecture. I'll call you after the class. Yeah. So they basically came together after the 2008 crisis, they realized that markets don't work perfectly, but that's what students were being taught all around the world. And therefore now there is a coalition of students across the world. 65, it actually should read 65 student coalition societies around the world, which have started this International Students Initiative for Pluralism in Economics. And what they say is we are dissatisfied with the dramatic narrowing of the curriculum that has taken place for the last couple of decades. Yeah, and you see, why don't syllabi change? Why don't syllabi change? And why doesn't teaching learning process change? Because I think what Dennis Nauer said in 2015 is also important. Almost everyone is opposed to fundamental changes in teaching, including the students who often learn by heart and don't want to think in new ways. So that, I think, has created a kind of a hysteresis, or kind of a path dependence in what is being taught, what is being learned. So, a kind of economics, just one kind of economics gets taught in schools and colleges. Students learn that and then they turn it. I'm sure that many of you here who are teachers of economics for years haven't really come across serious treatments of, say, feminist economics, or say institutional economics, or behavioral economics, or Marxist economics, in your regular teaching pedagogical processes. Yeah, so if you look at the Mumbai University syllabus, what do we start teaching students with? We start teaching students with demand curves, indifference curves, etc., etc. But which is one particular way of looking at human beings and their behavior, their economic behavior. There are many other ways of doing that. We unfortunately never teach that, and then those become the syllabi. That's where our next generation of teachers get trained, and our syllabi is structured in such a way that they don't really encourage us to think around a lot, right? So because unfortunately a lot of our syllabi, especially in Indian institutions, are structured in a way which require very little interaction with the real world, whereas economics is a way of thinking about the real world. Right, but unfortunately all that we do is we are into some textbook models, and we are asked to learn the assumptions, the conclusions, and then explain those models in our exams. So the whole pedagogy is only, whole teaching learning process only internalizing a given set of knowledge, understanding, instead of being able to apply that knowledge to the real world and ask questions of the real world, and also ask questions of the of what you learn in class. That never happens in our academic institutions, and because that never happens in academic institutions, we don't ask questions, and because we don't ask questions, we think that this is we actually just test students on their competencies in terms of internalizing what we teach them. Okay, and that's a very serious problem. And I think somehow in our country we need to start this discussion about our syllabi, about what students in economics should be learning. Yeah, students around the world are already doing that. Students and teachers around the world are already doing that. They're challenging the mainstream kind of economics. They're looking for more plural approaches, right? Okay, student organizations are already going to, say, the meetings of the American Economic Association and sticking posters around saying that please give us more relevant economics. They're going to panel discussions and asking questions. Yeah, so I think something of that kind is also needed in our country. If there's some discussion of that kind, is really important and is necessary that it takes place in our country. And one of the reasons why I wanted to have this course is to really be able to galvanize a group of students, teachers, who will at least start thinking and start questioning in different ways too. Right? Okay. So basically, I'll show you two good course materials. Okay. So there's one small video which I'll show you. All right. It's a very short video. Sometimes I think the You cannot hear the video? Okay. Okay. So I'll share the video. I'll share the PowerPoint with you. You can check the video. Yeah. I'll do that. I'll do that. No, you can see it later. Right. And then there is this important piece of, I think this is what you must all read. Radical philosophy, alternative economics, a new student movement. So that'll give you a review of the kind of discontent that's already happening, and the movements that students are leading about about an alternative approach to alternative economics pedagogy. Okay, so that's something that you can. This I'll share the PowerPoint with you, and you have it in the. So you can then look at this. Okay.
So can you please share the link?
So you'll basically have the link in the PowerPoint which I will send with you. I'll share this
Okay, fine.
PowerPoint with you.
Okay, sir.
Okay, fine. So now, what is economics about? You see, we are already always taught the definition by Lionel Robbins, sometime in the 30s, which says economics is a science which studies human behavior as a relationship between scarce resources and unlimited wants. Right? But there are lots of things hidden in this that already privileges a certain approach to economics. It says economics is a science. It says that economics is studies the relationship between as individuals go about trying to maximize utility or maximize satisfaction. So that actually that actually privileges that definition by itself says that economics is neoclassical economics. Economics is what we are usually taught of the demand supply curves and indifference curves and isoquants and firms maximizing profits and individuals maximizing utility and so on. But what it does not tell you is it's just one approach. Okay, so I like to look at economics in a much broader kind of a sense. Economic studies issues relating to economic well-being of society. Okay, right. So we are concerned about issues like poverty. We are concerned in issues like undernutrition. We are concerned with issues like inequality. Yeah, we are also interested in environmental degradation. We are interested in equality, economic equality. We are interested in many things. Okay, fine. So I'll start with a broader view of economics, and that I think is what many of you would think of economics as, something which is about overall well-being of our society, instead of just a way of efficient allocation of resources. Okay, all right. Okay. Then what are we going to study about? We're going to study about how societies go about producing goods and services. Okay, right? So how do societies, what are the production structures in the society? Who produces what? Right? Okay, how are those things distributed? Right? What is the organization of production in the society? Is it based on individuals optimizing some utility functions and firms optimizing profit functions, or does it have to do with certain classes in society? Does it have to do with power? Does it have to do with caste, community? What? Right? So that's the second question that we are going to answer: how societies produce goods and services. Okay, and not all goods and services are identical. Right? There are something like private goods, there are public goods, and there are common pool resources. So what's a private good? A private good is something you know which has two characteristics. One, something which can be, something which is rival in production, in consumption. So think of an ice cream. If I eat an ice cream, you can't eat that ice cream, the very same ice cream. So ice cream is rival in consumption, and it's also excludable. So I can exclude you from eating my ice cream, right? So those kinds of goods are called private goods. Then there are other goods called public goods. Public goods are goods which are neither rival in consumption nor excludable. Like for example, clean air. If I breathe in clean air, doesn't prevent you from breathing clean air at the same time. So so there is non-rivalness, and I can't really exclude you from benefits of the clean air, right? Even if I'm the one who's paying for cleaning the air and all that, right? So therefore, those are called public goods. And then there are goods which are called common pool resources, which are very important. Common pool resources are goods which are rival in consumption, but which are non-excludable. Like for example, I'm going to drive from Pune to Mumbai. Okay, I'm going to use the road space. Road space is rival in consumption. If I'm driving in a lane, you can't drive in the lane. But you cannot exclude me. I cannot exclude you from using the expressway. Okay, so expressway is a common pool resource. Or a river, a fish stock in a river is a common pool resource. Forests are common pool resources, right? And common pool resources are of critical importance now. So we're going to think of these three kinds of goods: how do societies produce goods, how do societies use those goods, and the services that come from these goods. But then how do societies value goods? So why does, for example, a bottle of mineral water sell for the price at which it sells? Okay, why is clean air, even if it's very valuable, not for sale? right? Okay. I'm also going to ask you certain questions about whether things ought to be for sale or not ought to be for sale. Because there is a branch of economics which says what mainstream economics says, that markets produce the best possible outcomes. The strengths of markets is that they allocate resources from where they're less valuable to resources where they're more valuable. Okay, so for example, and that then gets resources to their most valuable uses, which is supposed to have the strengths of the markets, right? But we need to ask questions about that as well. For example, there are more tigers in captivity in China than there are tigers in the wild in India, right? And why is that so? Because tigers in captivity are actually sold for tiger meat. Tiger bones are very valuable. Tiger skin is very valuable. Medicines are made from tiger products. So tiger in captivity is very, very valuable. So you have tigers who are kept in small cells of 8 feet by 8 feet and not fed much because their bones are going to be sold. And bones of extracted from tigers while they're still alive get a distinct color and therefore are much more valuable in the market. Or some tigers are sold for tiger meat, so they're again put into small cells and overfed with medicines and antibiotics so that they put on weight. They can barely walk. So those tigers are much more valuable. But of course, nobody would say that you would then say take all the tigers in the wild and put them into these businesses, right? Which would be considered unethical. Yeah, most of you would say that's not what market should be doing. So there are certain things which should be sold on the market, certain things which should not be sold in the market, and there are certain value positions that you must always take when you think of markets, right? So those are the kind of things that we would understand. They will also talk about why certain things are not valued and how products are distributed. And finally, we are going to be interested in how do economies grow, right? So what does economic growth do? Okay, how does economic growth happen? What are the different models for of understanding economic growth and its consequences? Is economic growth really good just by itself, or it's good because it satisfies certain objectives that we think are valuable and important in themselves, right? So those are the kind of questions that we're going to ask in this. Okay, so what I'll do is so there are different approaches, right? I'll first take you through the most dominant paradigm, okay, the neoclassical paradigm, which is the dominant paradigm, which is what you study everywhere in schools and colleges. And you write papers in this paradigm, they're more likely to get published. If you are and your job opportunities are better if you're actually an academic who's working in this tradition. So it's a very mainstream kind of a tradition, which you'll find in most textbooks, right? Okay. So basically, how do how do you conceive of an economy here, right? In the neoclassical approach. Please remember that today is going to be only an overview of different approaches. We're going to go into details of every approach and see the strengths and weaknesses, etc. Right. So basically, neoclassical economics sees the economy as consisting mainly of lots of individuals or lots of firms. Now, the individuals are really disembodied individuals. In essence, they're not, their social identities don't matter. That it doesn't matter whether a person is a black person or a Dalit or an upper caste Savarna or a woman, whatever, right? So in this approach, for example, a white European male has the same status as a decision maker as say maybe a woman who cleans the sewages in Delhi, right? So all people, so it's basically the identities simply don't matter. They're individuals per se, firms per se, right? And so so society is constituted of these. So there are consumers, individuals or consumers. There are firms, right? And individuals own these firms, right? So it's that kind of a structure. Okay. Ideally, there are many of these, right? There are many of these individuals. There are many of these firms, and they compete. They work in environment which is more or less competitive. So, for example, if you're producing something, then it's fairly easy for other producers to also enter into what you are doing. Information is more or less complete. There are no entry barriers, and so on. Okay, right. So that's the kind of a conception of the economy. Okay, right. There are three or four key ideas really, four or five, six key ideas, right? One is scarcity. So the idea is that resources are scarce. Okay, find scarce resources either at the disposal of individuals or at the disposal of firms are scarce resources, and then your wants are many. So the idea is to use the scarce resources to actually satisfy these wants in the best possible way. So the key idea is there is no free lunch. Okay, there is no free lunch. There is always, because there is scarcity, any resource which is used for one particular objective, right, in one particular line, could have had an alternative use in some other line. Okay, so for example, if I have 1,000 rupees and go out to the market, then I can decide to either watch a movie and have lunch, or I can use those 1,000 rupees to buy myself a shirt, right? But if I buy a shirt, then I obviously can't watch the movie. If I watch the movie, then I have to forego the shirt, right? So the essential ideas of opportunity costs. Opportunity costs arise because we have scarcity. Right? The money costs are not really important to an economist's way of thinking. Right? It doesn't matter that a shirt costs say 800 rupees and a film costs 700 rupees. The point is, if I watch a film, I have to forego a shirt. If I buy the shirt, I have to forego the movie. Right? So these are the opportunity costs, and what matter really is opportunity costs. That's why we say there is no free lunch. So if you're having lunch, somebody calls you for a free lunch, you could obviously be using that time to do something else, just sleep at home or whatever, right? So opportunity cost is the key idea, right? Absolute key idea in economics is, in the mainstream economics, is the idea of opportunity cost, which arises because resources are considered to be scarce. Okay, right. Now, given opportunity cost, yeah. Heavenly, I'm in a class. Can I call you to 5 minutes, half an later? Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah. Okay. Opportunity cost. Okay. So we just threw opportunity cost. The next important is marginal thinking. So you must always think on the margin. What do you mean by thinking on the margin? So maybe I want to, I have a certain amount of resources. Okay. And I want to utilize the resources in two or three different directions. Okay. So maybe if I use one of that resource into, say, 1 rupee, and that gives me a return, a certain amount of return, then that return is called the marginal return on that 1 rupee. Right? So the return that I get on every additional rupee is what is called the marginal return. So for example, if I'm deciding whether to eat an additional apple, suppose I've been sitting in a I've been eating apples at breakfast, and I'm thinking of eating an additional apple. Right. So the point is, the happiness that I get, or the utility that I get, satisfaction that I get from eating an additional apple, right, is the marginal utility. So if I am to decide whether I should eat this apple or I should have a slice of bread with jam, right, then what I must compare is the additional utility that I will get from eating one more apple to the additional utility that I will get from consuming one more slice of bread with jam on it. Right? If the additional utility that I get from consuming one more unit of apple is more than that which I get from consuming one more slice of bread, then I must eat an apple. Right? I must eat an additional apple. Right? That is marginal thinking. Thinking at the margin. Okay, thinking at the margin, right? So I think that is another core idea of neoclassical economics. So basically you must think at the at the margin, what an additional unit of your resource gives you, right? And you must then put it, and if you are a utility maximizer, or if you are a if you are a profit maximizer, then you must deploy your resources in such a way that you get the maximum returns for every additional resource that you get, right? So that's how marginal thinking goes. Because marginal thinking, sunk costs do not matter. So investments already made, costs already incurred, don't really matter in decision making. Like for example, if I go to a restaurant and order an expensive dish, yeah, and after eating, and I tasting, after tasting that, if I find that that dish doesn't taste very good, right? Okay, then I should not think of the fact that I've already paid for this huge dosa, right, which is there in front of me. Whether I eat it or not, I'm going to get a bill, right? And that I'll have to pay for it anyway. So your usual way of thinking would be if I'm going to pay for it anyway, I might as well eat it. But the idea that some costs do not matter will say that, look here, if you, whether you eat it or not eat it, you'll have to still pay for it, right? That cost is not recoverable now. So if eating an additional, eating that dosa makes you unhappy, don't eat it. Stop eating it, right? Stop eating it. Like for example, if you have 3 hours at your disposal, and you can either watch a movie or watch a play, right? And you've actually bought tickets for a movie. You go into a movie and you find that that movie is terrible, right? Then the idea of sunk cost will say, don't do that. Don't sit in the auditorium any longer. If you don't like it, because your ticket's already been paid for, get out. If every 1 hour spent, or say next an additional hour spent on the movie gives you less satisfaction than spending an hour on an opera, then please go and see the opera, right? Don't waste your time in watching the movie anymore just because you're paid for the movie. So sunk costs are sunk costs, right? Sunk costs are uh, do not matter, right? Now, what is the next assumption, next idea? That individuals are rational decision makers maximizing utility. So basically, various activities that we do, we get certain satisfaction. I'm going to look at these ideas a little bit more critically, right? We get certain satisfaction, and basically individuals are trying to maximize utility, right? So what they do, essentially individuals are born, the rational thing to do is to maximize utility, and the economic agents are rational decision makers. So they can actually evaluate the costs and benefits of the utilities that they will get from various activities, and they can compare them, and then they can actually choose the ones, they do actually choose the ones which give them the maximum utility, right? Similarly, firms are said to be rational profit maximizers. So firms have a clear idea, fairly clear idea of what are the different options that they have, what are the profits from each of these options, and then the firms consciously and carefully choose those options which maximize their profits, right? So that is the rational individual, right? And rational firm. So by rationality, economics, there are two ways in which you conceive rationality. I'm going to come to that, right? Okay. By rationality, we mean basically when you think of a rational consumer as against rational preferences, as we think of a rational consumer, we are going to think of a consumer whose single-minded idea is to maximize utility, his or her own utility. Right? So individuals are optimistic, selfish individuals who don't give a damn to what happens to others, right? But each one is trying to maximize his or her utility. So there are no ideas of fairness or, altruism, right? These are very difficult ideas to understand in the way, in the economist's worldview. Similarly, firms are single-mindedly devoted to maximizing profits, right? By and large, there are other models of firms, but that's what firms do. Now, what do you mean by utility? Traditionally we thought that utility is the capacity of a commodity to satisfy a human want, right? So if I, for example, my cell phone has a certain utility in the sense it helps me make calls and receive calls, and I can surf the net and answer emails and all those kind of things on the phone. But economists have a different conception. For an economist, utility is only an ordinal number. It is not a cardinal number. So it's nothing like an absolute utility that I get. All that I can say is the utility that I get from a cell phone is more than the utility that I get from my pair of spectacles. It's and the utility I get from a pair of spectacles is more than the utility that I get from the rose plant outside my window. Now there are some, that's the ordinal utility concept. So that is what is required, right? So I need to be able to represent utilities by real numbers. So I can say that the utility that I get from my phone is 100, utility I get from my pair of spectacles is 50, and the utility that I get from the rose outside is 10, right? Any other set of numbers is equally good at representing these utilities, these preferences that I have, really, okay, as long as the same preference, the same ordering is maintained. So as long as the number that represents the utility of a cell phone is more than the number that represents the utility of a pair of spectacles, which is more than the number that represents the utility of the rose outside my window, right? Then that's fine. Utilities are only meant to be such numbers which only describe the order of preferences. They themselves don't have any absolute value, right? And this term in economics came sometime in the 1930s and the 40s, when you say when we realized that you really can't have an absolute number for the utility of a pair of spectacles. Right. Okay. You can't right, and it's very difficult when you say, when you're thinking of utility as as some quality which satisfies a human want. For example, I might have certain utility from marijuana, or I might have some utility for LSD, and I might prefer LSD over a glass of healthy milk. Right. I might prefer to smoke a cigarette over, say, and lie in my couch and drink beer, uh, instead of going out for an early morning jog. Whereas what really satisfies a human want of good health would be going out for an early morning jog. So because of these issues, the moral content of what utility is, or the normative content of what utility should have been, was taken away because you needed a science. You needed a science without much of a moral or ethical normative content, and therefore we redefined the utility as just a set of numbers, right, which are supposed to just show the preference ordering of an individual, right, that the individual prefers cell phone more to his pair of spectacles, which he or she prefers more to the rose outside his window, and therefore the number, you associate some number with the with the cell phone, and then a lower number with the spectacles, and an even lower number with the pair of with the roses. Now there's an implicit assumption. The implicit assumption in it is that I can actually compare the satisfaction which I get from looking at the rose outside my window, and the satisfaction that I get from using the cell phone, and the satisfaction which I get, or whatever I get, from using my pair of spectacles. So all these things must be comparable. That is called, therefore, any option that the individual has, right? The individual must be able to compare the utilities of those various alternatives that the individual has. So those utilities have to come to a common scale, and that is an ordinal scale of numbers, right? Whereas somebody might argue that the happiness or the utility that I get from watching an old Hindi movie cannot really be compared with the utility that I get from, say, playing a video game, right? Those are different things, right? That is not allowed in the economist conception. In the economist conception, all alternatives that are before the consumer have to be comparable in terms of being able to be put into a preference ordering. You need to be able to say that I prefer my cell phone to my spectacles, which I prefer to the rose outside, which I prefer to listening to Chaudavi Ka Chand, right? And I think that's a difficult assumption to make, but without this assumption, you really don't have new classical economics. You can't do the most basic things in economics, because if you can't compare, then you can't have utilities, right? And if you can't have these utilities as numbers, then you cannot think of an individual as maximizing utility. And if the individual is not maximizing utility, then you don't have much of economics, right? So I think that's something that one must always keep in mind when you're thinking of individual rational behavior, utility ordinal concept. And individuals are poor individuals, as I said. They're completely disembodied individuals. They're not, so they're not mothers in a family, right? Or they're not necessarily, or they're not, say, so basically identities don't matter. And George Akerlof and Janet Yellen wrote a very interesting book sometimes 4 or 5 years ago called Identity Economics, which said how identities are actually absolutely important, right? They determine how people function, and For example, ascriptive state identities give ascriptive status in a country like India, and that determines how people are going to behave with people with different identities. Yeah, not only that, but also people themselves might want to conform to certain identities and might change their behavior. Right, so that is the basic idea in the Akerlof-Yellen book. But that unfortunately in the mainstream economics, that's also not really, identities don't matter, right? And so individuals are selfish, individuals are rational utility maximizers, individuals can compare all alternatives before them on the same scale, right? And who they are in their social life doesn't matter. Social life doesn't matter. These are the consumers, right? So for me, for example, as an economist, a tribal in Gadchiroli would be the same, would have the same economic behavior as, say, a stock market investor in Mumbai, right? So I think that's the kind of assumption that we have there, right? Okay. Now the point is individual preferences. What individuals prefer is not an economist's purview. So whether I prefer my cell phone to my spectacles, which I prefer to my newspaper, is to be given to the economist. The economist is not supposed to have any judgment on that. Yes, so preferences are given, right? And I think which is a very important assumption, which is actually underlying a lot of conclusions in economics, which we will deal with later. Right. So preferences are to be given. Preferences are not in the purview of the economist, but they have to be rational. Now, a rational individual, as we said, is an individual who single-mindedly maximizes utility. Okay, whose objective in life is to maximize utility. The rational individual is somebody who tries to make the most of his limited resources. Whereas rational preference is something different. Rational preferences are supposed to have two properties. One is completeness, the other is transitivity. What is completeness? Completeness is simply the idea that an individual can place all the options that he or she has before him or her on a common ordinal scale. So everything that the individual has access to, right, can consume potentially, can be placed in some sort of a preference ordering, right? And there is something that cannot be placed in this kind of a preference ordering in a relational system. If there is something like that, then the preference ordering is said to be incomplete. So complete, when I say I have complete preference ordering, and if there are 10 alternatives I have, then it means that I can place all these 10 alternatives in a relational order vis-a-vis each other, starting with the one which is the most preferred, starting with the one, then the next most preferred, the next most preferred, finally the least preferred. Right? So anything in the world, anything that I consume I need to be able to place that in that kind of a complete ordering. The second idea is transitivity. That is, if I prefer apples to oranges and I prefer oranges to bananas, then I must prefer apples to bananas. That is a transitivity idea. Right? So if I prefer apples to oranges and I prefer oranges to bananas, then I must prefer apples to bananas. Yeah, because I prefer apples to oranges and oranges prefer to bananas. So I must prefer apples to bananas. That's the assumption for transitivity. And the idea that individual behavior, individual individual preferences are both complete and transitive is absolutely crucial to the idea of modern microeconomics, right? What goes on policy, right? I think the reason I'm focusing on this is because a lot of policy prescriptions which are based on modern neoclassical thinking actually derive from these assumptions which are absolutely essential to developing those ideas, right? To reaching those policy conclusions. Okay, right? And therefore, it's important that all of us have a good sense of what these assumptions are, right? Okay, and we know many times, so preferences can be non-transitive. Okay, social preferences can be non-transitive, was proved by Kenneth Arrow. It's called the Arrow impossibility theorem, that decision making in a group, it's most likely that group decisions will never be transitive, and therefore group decisions will be impossible to be made. But we'll come to that. So, but I think more fundamental is that essential idea is that to have think of individuals. There's a theorem actually which says that if you want to think of individuals as rational utility maximizers, then their preferences have to be rational. That is, their preferences have to be complete and transitive. Their preferences are not complete and transitive, then you cannot think of them as maximizing utility. If you cannot think of them as maximizing utility, then the whole idea of utility maximizing individuals and indifference curves and demand curves and supply curves, etc., don't work out. So these are very fundamental ideas to economics. Okay, right? And slowly as we go on, we will kind of decode these ideas. Right. So impersonal markets allocate resources, determine prices, right? So there are all these individuals who are rational utility maximizers, and there are firms which are rational profit maximizers, and they interact with each other. And then if there are lots of people who prefer red shirts over green shirts, and there are firms which are not making enough red shirts and they're making a lot of green shirts, then the price of red shirts will rise related to price of green shirts. And then the firms which are making red shirts will realize that actually profit to be made is making red shirts, so they will start making more red shirts and they'll start making fewer green shirts because there's an opportunity cost of making red shirts which is making green shirts, so fewer green shirts, and therefore the market will now allocate resources efficiently from where they were not wanted to from where they were wanted. And the basic and that is supposed to be the strength of the market mechanism. Okay, the strength of the market mechanism is that it allocates resources in a very complex economic system, right, without requiring too much information or too much intervention by any central planner. In fact, the central planner would never really have the information that red shirts are more valuable than green. There's greater demand for red shirts compared to green shirts. But mechanism is left unfettered, if the prices are allowed to adjust in the market, then red shirts would have a higher price compared to green shirts, and therefore they will automatically, firms making red shirts would want to sort of shift from making green shirts to red shirts, and the allocation, resource allocation would be achieved automatically. Okay, resource allocation would be achieved automatically. Therefore, impersonal markets allocate resources and determine prices through the mechanism of demand and supply, and the price mechanism is then seen as a massive resource allocation mechanism. Okay, resource allocation mechanism. So basically, prices contain information. Okay, the critical idea is that prices contain information. Prices are massive information supplying devices. Okay, the kind of information which you would never otherwise have in a centrally planned economy. There's a whole debate between markets and central planning that happened in the 60s and the 70s, right? So basically that's the strength of prices, right? Okay, uh, right. The next point is then unregulated markets give optimal outcomes. Okay, so because markets allocate resources from their less useful to their more useful, right? Okay, they allocate resources, and if you tamper with markets, obviously there's going to be a problem. So for example, if there is not enough demand for labor, right? So if for example the price of labor is too high, suppose you fix a minimum wage that is too high, right? Then you're really tampering with the price mechanism and the information on how much labor is demanded in certain places, and how many people are wanting to work in the market. That information device will have a distortion, and therefore there will be a market distortion. The idea, therefore, is that you should not regulate prices. Okay, if you regulate prices, you're really playing with an information supplying device, right? And therefore, the signals in the economy get distorted. Yeah. So, for example, if wages are too high, if you fix by law, if you put minimum wages too high, then people who are willing to supply labor will think that there's a lot of demand for labor. So there will be a lot of people who are willing to supply labor, but there will not be enough people who will actually demand that labor at those prices, and therefore what will result is in unemployment. Right, that is the whole idea. Therefore, if you actually tamper with markets, if you tamper with prices, then you kind of sacrifice the efficiency of the price mechanism in terms of supplying information, and therefore you create market distortions. Yeah, that is the basic kind of an idea. Okay. Again, there are provisions, right? There are limitations to this idea. There are externalities, and there are, you know, public goods and common pool resources. And when there are monopolies, etc., this market mechanism doesn't work. But we will deconstruct those ideas. We'll talk about this as we come over the next few classes. Now, what happens is, because this whole thing looks like a huge machine, I talk about information, demand and supply curve shifting up and down, and information flowing and resources being allocated, the whole thing looks almost as if it's a scientific objective fact, right? It's some machine working out there, outside society, and with which you can't tamper because it's the law, right? Okay, so that sometimes what happens is you begin to look at this as an objective economic fact. But obviously, it's not an objective economic fact. I think that's one of the problems with this. Like, for example, in the example of tigers, which I gave, right? The price for tiger bones and tiger body parts is much more today, much higher today than, say, the value of tigers in the wild, which you don't even know how to value, right? Now, does that mean that it's actually a law? It's actually a natural phenomenon, okay, that tigers will be taken from the wild and their body parts will be sold, right? And finally, more importantly, because it's scientific, should that happen? Should that be allowed? For example, a small child, an 8-year-old child playing in the fields, going to school, is probably less valuable to the pet, to somebody, than a child working in a restaurant washing dishes, right? Because it's going to produce more economic return there. But are we comfortable with the idea that children should stop going to school and start working in the restaurants? Yeah. So the point is, you're not comfortable with those ideas. Many of us will not be comfortable with those ideas. I can think of some very poor person who is not earning much, but if he sold his kidneys, he would actually, his kidneys are much more valuable if he sells them in the market, on the black market, than in his own body. But does that mean that we ought to really allow this, that people should actually be allowed, that there should be a market for body parts like that? Do we want a society? Do we even want a society which sees an individual as consisting of various body parts which have certain markets? Do you want a society which, whenever it sees a tiger, sees money coming from tiger skin or tiger blood or tiger bones, right? So the question is, this, even when it sounds scientific, right, okay, is actually based on certain moral, ethical value judgments. And good economic policy therefore requires you to have certain value judgments, right? Okay, basically certain wisdom, right? And that's not what science is, right? Science doesn't require you. Science doesn't depend on wisdom. Science is basically a physical reality happening out there. Economics is not like that, right? And that's again the point I'm going to talk to you about. There's a very interesting book called Why Certain Things Should Not Be for Sale, right? And we're going to talk about those ideas also as we go on. Okay. So this is really broadly what neoclassical economics is about. Okay, right? So your society is consisting of many disembodied individuals, all of whom can put all their preferences in order, who can always compare the various alternatives that are before them on a similar scale, right? Who are rational in the sense, who can to maximize their utilities, working on marginal kind of principles, which results in a market mechanism, which is a mechanism of demand and supply, where resources get allocated optimally, and therefore there is certain sanctity to this mechanism, and tampering with this mechanism is then creating market distortions. So therefore you should let that mechanism be, and it kind of leads to the optimal benefit of society, which many times is referred to as Pareto optimality or Pareto efficiency, right? That's the kind of a picture we have of neoclassical economics, right? On the other hand, there are the other approaches. Think of classical Marxist approach. I think key difference here is that you don't think of the economy consisting of many disembodied individuals. These individuals have certain locations, and those locations are in terms of the class that they belong to. For example, they might own means of production, right? So they are capitalists, or they might own nothing but their labor, which they sell to capitalists. Then they are workers, right? They're workers. Or there might be people who are only selling their intellectual outputs, right? They might be clerks, for example. They might be poets, right? So individuals, it's not individuals, it is class locations of individuals and classes, which is really what matters, you know. And that's not necessarily true only of the Marxist approach. For example, in Adam Smith, if you look at classical political economy, if you look at Smith, Ricardo, you have classes. You don't have individuals. Individuals step in with Marshall, right? When Marshall begins to look at microeconomics, right? We look at individuals maximizing utility, maximizing satisfaction, so on. But before that, there's classes and individual classes, and the classes and these individuals, I mean, these classes have a certain relationship with each other, right? For example, in the Marxist political economy, workers sell their labor to capitalists, and then capitalists produce a surplus value from this, and then there are certain dynamics because the interests are antagonistic to each other. Class conflict happens and society undergoes changes. So basically dynamism in society, right? Okay, so specific technology and organizational productive activity based on the technology, the relationship of production or the economy. So what is the economy in this context? The economy in this sense is really the kind of organization of production that happens around a specific technology of production, right? Which also are called the relationships of production. So the economy essentially relationships of production. So workers sell their labor to capitalists. Capitalists produce, produce a surplus value and spend that surplus value, right? So it is that kind of relationship structure, which is what gives the, which is how the economy is. Okay, right? So the fundamental difference here is that in the neoclassical system, we have disembodied individuals who maximize utility and all those kinds of things, whereas in the classical Marxist approaches, there are classes. And classes whose basically, at the dynamism of, and basically the interaction between these classes is what drives the economy, right? Which creates the economy, which takes the economy ahead or takes it into a crisis and what on. And again, we are going to look at it, this whole story in detail as we go on. Then there's a feminist economics, which has become now more and more important from the 90s, especially after the 90s. This has become a separate discipline, really. Okay, different special way of looking at economics. And I think, an important turning point there was Julie Nelson's 1995 article, Feminism and Economics, in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, which you must look at. Right, so here, looking at the history of science, feminist economics looks at science, right? Values in science have been dominated by masculinity. Okay, and essentially, so for example, men, so they're all consumers, they're producers, right? Whereas women in society, for example, have different roles, right? There is no role, for example, for in that kind of a structure for women who are producing, domestic services, which are not valued on the market. Right? Okay. So basically need to move around beyond the gender set in 4 ideas. One is modeling. Okay, so conception of rational choosers for whom there is never a need for care or considerations like fairness. Okay. Secondly, feminist methods are also now increasingly critical of the logical purity of mathematics as against messy empirics. Okay, to give you a story, right? So, for example, if you look at the look at India's economic development over the last few decades, what you see is women's work participation rates have been falling. Women have been dropping off the labor force. Right now, obviously, there is an identity involved here. There is not all. It's not that just there are some economic agents are dropping off. There are women. Women are dropping off because they're in a particular gendered patriarchal frame. And what probably is happening is, one of the arguments that feminist economists make is that as economic development happens, men's wages start going up, and because men's wages start going up, women who are working in the labor market now stop working in the labor market, because families who women work in the labor market are no longer considered respectable, and women think of working in the labor market as drudgery. Uh, it's, most of the time that's also true because they're working as domestic workers or lowly uh, paid work, and then they drop off and start getting into domesticity, where from producing output on the market, from being on the market related activities, what they become is they really become unpaid domestic workers. Yeah. So you see, there's clearly a gendered view approach to this. You can't understand this phenomenon without looking at gender and gender dimensions, and how basically the productive roles of men and women in society are constructed differently. So that's also something that those kinds of arguments also something we are going to go into fairly detailed, right? So again here, so basically because you have to depend a lot on you to understand different constructions of identity, different constructs of gender. You can't do it from a purely mathematical point of view, because for a utility maximizing individual, social identities don't matter. So if you think of social identities, you have to think of specific empirical situations. You have to think of women in urban India who are in the unorganized sector, right? Then it all boils down to really looking at the data and looking at messy empirics rather than clear cut, nice, mathematical model. So a lot of feminist economics is really about empirics, good empirics, messy empirics, good empirics, and trying to see something from the data rather than really build these kinds of theoretical models, which are essentially based on pure mathematics, right? And which is a fundamental difference between neoclassical economics and feminist economics. So that's something that's important. Again, you see that what are the things that should be studied? Feminist economics also says that you have to, in general, in the neoclassical approach, in the mainstream approach that we have, okay, what is not really studied is, what is not looked at is activities which are undertaken outside markets and in families, right? For example, looking after kids, looking after elderly, right? Looking after the family is an activity which is not a market activity, and definitely it's not a market activity which is not even research. And feminist economists are now saying that look, there are a lot of activities that happen outside markets, and you need to also study those activities which happen outside markets. And of course, teaching again is participatory, more applied teaching, because the whole focus is on empirics, understanding concrete realities around you. So it is less on formal mechanistic modeling in class, but it's more on dealing with, participatory real world teaching, right? Real world applied kind of a teaching. For example, helping a student understand okay, and that's helping a student who comes from, a young Muslim girl who comes from Mumbai, helping her understand why she's finding, why, for example, what are the constraints that she faces? How are these constraints different from constraints faced by somebody else? And kind of, so basically, teaching learning happens that where you actually create human capacities. And in this process, the teacher also transforms himself or herself, right? So it's that kind of a teaching which feminist economics talks about. Then there is now increasingly popular behavioral economics, which doesn't take a class approach, right? But which says that there is a problem with the way neoclassical economics thinks about the world, because A, all people are not always rational decision makers. People have several psychological biases, cognitive limitations, right? And which clearly lead to different results, right? So which make many important results in mainstream economics not valid. Okay, and therefore that's the behavioral economics approach, which is also significant now in many different areas of economics, right? This is also sometimes also combined with experimental economics, because you can actually do certain experiments in controlled circumstances and test out certain theories. Finally, there is a new institutional economics, okay, which essentially incorporates the theory of institutions, laws, rules, customs, and norms into economics. It builds on, modifies, and extends neoclassical theory. It retains and builds on, which is a base of choice, the basic choice theoretic approach that underlies economics. But now, new statistical economics therefore understand how rules of the game, laws, people like Douglas North, for example, who won the Nobel Prize for in economics, are people who have actually pioneered this kind of a view of looking at economics, laws, rules, customs, norms into economics. Right? It builds on. So basically, how does the way society is structured? What role do norms play? What role do rules play? What role do specific institutions in society play? And I think that is where we can now get entry points into institutions like caste. But again, you see that we will again say what the limitations, strengths, as well as limitations of this approach are. And finally, what I think is important now increasingly is a recent book by a lady called Kate Raworth, an economist, woman economist called Kate Raworth, called Donut Economics: 7 Ways to Think Like a 21st Century Economist. What is donut economics? Kate Raworth argues that, of course, we want economic growth, but we don't want unlimited economic. Because unlimited, we don't want economic growth which is so fast that it drives us over the ecological barrier, and we go into a self-destruct button. So what Kate Raworth argues is that there is a certain amount of growth which you surely require, because that growth will ensure that people have decent standards of living. Certain amount of economic growth that's required because that will ensure that people have decent standard of living. But we don't also want to grow so fast that we ruin the ecosystems, right? We ruin the planet. So there is a boundary in between growing just fast enough so that people get good, that minimal growth which must happen to ensure that people have access to good quality of life, and that rapid reckless growth which will destroy the planet. So there is that whole boundary in between which she calls the donut. The donut, for example, you have a hole in between, then you have something around it, and then the brink of the donut. So it is on that donut that we must function. And what Kate Raworth has done is actually derived certain certain measures of how to decide how does one, by quantifying, how does one sort of operationalize this idea. So this very interesting book called Donut Economics is about operationalizing that idea, right, and making it actually a concrete structure. And many cities now are actually going for donut economics kind of policies. So that's something that we will also discuss as this course goes on, right? Now, guys, when we started this course, I had initially said that this will have to be a 3-hour course every day, every Sunday. But I think 3 hours will be putting too much of a will be put too much of pressure on myself and everybody else. Also, there's a lot of reading that will need to be covered. So what we'll do is we'll keep that as a 1.5 hour kind of sessions with a lot of reading. And for the next class, there'll also be discussion on what you have, on what you're supposed to have read, right? So in the next class, you're supposed to have read what I gave in the link, right, in that first link about what the general discontent about economics is. And in the next class, we'll have a detailed discussion of what neoclassical economics is about. It'll take us 3 or 4 lectures to really understand the building blocks in a critical fashion of neoclassical economics. In the meanwhile, if you have any doubts, difficulties, and if you want to discuss anything, please feel free. Any questions on this?
Sir, the Macy empiric concept was not clear.
Which one?
If you could help. Macy empirics we talked about.
Macy
Actually,
empirics is, you see, what happens is, so basically, because what, when you understand, so the idea of feminist economics is, when you're trying to understand individuals, you must understand they have specific locations, specific gender locations. So you cannot have a purely theoretical model where individuals are disembodied abstract individuals, because here we are thinking of individuals who have specific social locations. Yeah. So you can't, for example, have an indifference curve where you just have a consumer, right? But it matters whether this consumer is a woman, whether a man, the caste, community, gender, everything matters, right? So if in that case, what we will have to do is to look at the empirical details, right, of what we see from the data. We need to build our theory from what we see from the data rather than pure mathematical abstract modeling, because now there are concrete individuals involved. Okay, right? And therefore it will have to be about data more than models. And because all data, as you know, are actually, there's no clean data. Data are difficult to generate, right? Especially if you have data, many times data are not even available. So the empirics becomes messy, unclear, dirty. So you must have debates about data, right? Whether data are actually measured. For example, what you should do is you can have debates about GDP and whether GDP is measured correctly, especially when it doesn't take into account all the services produced by women in households. So if you can't do that, then how do you actually address this issue, right? So it's that kind of a messy empirics is what really feminist economics will mainly deal with, instead of abstract theorizing of economic individuals.
Nice. Thank you, sir.
Yeah?
Yeah, thank you, sir.
Excuse me, sir.
Yeah. So neoclassical economics is not distinct from marginalist. Okay? Right? Marginalism is a very essential introduction to, as a very essential ingredient of the whole neoclassical approach of maximization. Yeah. Thanks, Manjiri, for sharing this very interesting book, Identity Economics. It's a very good book. Yeah.
Sir,
I wish we
actually,
had recorded this lecture, but I don't know whether we have. But from next lecture, we'll record these lectures.
sir, I wanted to ask one question. So don't you think we need to take multidisciplinary approach rather taking the pure approach? Now we are going into it actually. For example, environmental economics currently, which is in much discussion, and many universities have put that into the syllabus. Like there are so many. But multidisciplinary angle one has to take, and I think it should be incorporated into the syllabus, sir. I would like to.
Yeah, sure. So I think we should have a more critical approach to economics. So we should actually have plurality. We should be able to understand what are the different ways of understanding about economic society, because you see, economic society is complex. Okay, there are individuals, interacting in certain ways. There are classes. So each of these models which I talked about have a certain element of validity to them, right? And therefore it's very important that we actually expose students to the plurality of doing things. And that is what students around the world are demanding. They say, please don't teach us just this one thing. But if you look at a textbook, if you surf the net and see what is thinking like an economist, you will see all kinds of PowerPoints from Mankey's book, which say these are the 10 ways of thinking about an economics, thinking like an economics, all of which are in the neoclassical tradition. So the idea is to actually emphasize to students and also understand for ourselves that what we have learned, what we are learning in our schools and colleges is one approach of to look at the overall problem, right? And there are different, so basically you need to have different tools for different kinds of things that you're dealing with. And you need to, therefore we need to have more pluralism, and pluralism will come only when we ask questions. So we must have more critical approaches to economics. So our teaching, I think, must, should engage more and more with the real world, right? Trying to understand the real world, trying to build our knowledge on understanding the real world, trying to question our own understanding to see whether it helps us to interpret the real world better. In a way, a learning which transforms the world, transforms ourselves, and transforms our students. I think that is the kind of learning that we need to go for economics.
Good evening, sir. I am Venkat. Sir, you had talked about regarding the classical or Marxist approach. You had
Right.
talked about how contradictions and class interests drive economic change. So,
Right.
could you please talk a little bit more about that, sir?
Yeah, I want to go in detail about this, right? But for example, in the classical Marxist approach, surplus value comes from exploitation. Yeah, so workers, so you have capitalists who own means of production, you have workers who own nothing but labor. They were the labor and capital work together in the whole process of in that whole process through exploitation, surplus value is generated, right? And because capitalists want to maximize surplus value, what happens is consumption gets depressed, and therefore profit rates also get depressed, and the economy runs into a crisis. That's how economic change happens, through interaction between various classes. Hello?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I'm
Yeah,
following up on that. So does
right.
the economic change here necessarily equate to economic growth?
Not necessarily. Economic growth will also be an economic crisis,
Right. Thank you very
right?
much, sir. Thank you
Yeah.
very
So
much.
we're going to actually develop these. It's just an introduction. We're going to develop each of these ideas in a lot of detail, so that we have a fairly round out understanding of what. And like you, I'm also one of the reasons why I'm doing this course is because I also want to learn and put ideas together, right?
Thank you so much for doing this,
Yeah.
sir.
Yeah. Any more questions? Yeah. I think Vijay, a very interesting book with a old classic called Robert Heilbronner. Right, there's a man called Robert Heilbronner, and there's a very good text by Robert Heilbronner, which all of us grew up reading. I think, particularly lucky to have to learn my economics during the heydays of the Cold War, because we had whole Marxist approaches to economics and then neoclassical economics, and everybody thought there were two different economic systems. So we always could actually compare different ways of organizing economic activity there before us. Right, we could see the strengths, weaknesses, and so on. I think post Cold War, the liberal kind of an economy, which also called neoliberalism, seems to, as you know, I think, uncontested sway, complete hegemony over the way we think, right? And therefore, a lot of alternative ideas have become marginalized, whereas they actually should be playing a bigger role. So I think Robert Heilbronner's book is good. Then, if you really want to, then there is a book called 10 Great Economists by Robert Schumpeter, by Joseph Schumpeter. Joseph Schumpeter, 10 Great Economists. And of course, the classic History of Economic Analysis by Joseph Schumpeter, but that's a very big book. So if you can actually even read, a 10 Great Economists by Joseph Schumpeter, and then there is Lionel Robbins's Lectures on the History of Economic Thought, which is to give in the London School of Economics, which some of his students have now put together notes from that lecture. So this is Lionel Robbins, Lectures on the History of Economic Thought. So I think these three books should be fairly good to help you understand the basic ideas in economics, basic ideas in economic history. There's a point. At one point in time, history of economic ideas used to be an indispensable part of teaching in economics. Economic history used to be an indispensable part of teaching in economics. So you knew how ideas had come about. You knew how your economy had come about, right? But unfortunately, again, with the entire dominance of this neoclassical ideas, and markets are important to understand, and the whole mathematical apparatus, these old approaches have fallen by the side. Very few universities now actually teach a course in the history of economic thought, but I think it's important to be able to understand that there are different ways of looking at things. Yeah. So Neha, yeah. Yes, I think Robert Heilbronner's book is a very good book for that. Robert Heilbronner, Story of Economic Thought, or something of that kind. So what we'll do, Neha, is as we go on, as I deal with each individual school, okay, we will kind of create reading lists, okay, so that there'll be, so for each individual school there'll be a separate reading list. Yeah, of course, Deva, we'll have some inputs on Keynesian economics as well. Yeah. No, I think Neha, behavioral economics searched for a while, but now mainstream economics has kind of incorporated among itself. You see, what happens is, uh, as I said, till about the 90s, the late 80s, we actually thought of neoclassical as a one way of doing economics. It's the whole counterpart of the whole communist world and a certain way of looking at economics and left radical political economy and all those very important voices. So we thought of but I think after the fall of the Soviet Union and by and large the dominance of the market, right, neoclassical regimes, the really dominance or the dominance of capitalism, market-based capitalism, what has happened is economics which justifies those kinds of production process, those kinds of economic systems, have naturally become prominent. Then also what happens is institutions. If something becomes prominent, then people have careers to make. That you get more lucrative careers. You're likely to get more likely to get jobs if you have got published papers which are in the neoclassical stream of thinking. So a lot of researchers actually start doing that. The journals with those kinds of dominant paradigms become more popular, more professionally highly rated. So if you publish in those journals, you get a highly professional recognition. So that kind of a sociology of that kind of internal professional dynamics of any discipline also drives this. Now sometimes this gets jolted out of its complacence, right, like it did after the 2008 crisis. And that is why people began to look for alternatives, and I think behavioral economics searched for some time. And as of now it's been established as a separate way of looking at economics, just like feminist economics, etc. But the mainstream economics retains its core strengths, right? It still is the core, right? So about majority of economists, mainstream economists, will still be, still be neoclassical economists, and most understanding of economics will still come from neoclassical economics. So behavioral economics, feminist economics, all those will exist side by side. Behavioral economics has never become the dominant paradigm in economics. Dominant paradigm is still neoclassical economics, right? And will continue to be for some time till the basic capitalist way of organizing society does not undergo a change. Yeah. Yeah. Pranit, the point I'll try to make in detail when we think about that book called Why Certain Things Should Not Be for Sale is that behind every economic policy, there has to be some ethical judgment. Like, for example, I said, a rational, purely profit maximizing agent, right? Profit maximizing economic agent would actually focus on capturing tigers from the wild and selling their bones, right? Okay. But the question is, do you really want to have that? Right. So the question that you want to have is whether, that protecting tigers, whether deciding whether this is good or bad is actually an ethical position. And the ethical position will have to be taken beforehand, right, prior to economic analysis. So you'll have to already have made up your mind saying that no, even when it's rational to take tigers from forests and put them into breeding cages and sell their bones, it's more profitable. We are not going to have that. Right. So there are certain ethical positions which economists will always have to take. Uh, it's not that the market by itself is rational and therefore efficient and therefore has its own ethics, right? Ethical by itself, right? So that's the point I will try to make later on. No, that's the whole point, Pravit, I'm going to make. That certain things, ethical is not highly relative. For example, children should be in school and not working in the restaurants is not a relative concept, right? Or tigers ought to be in the wild. That tigers in the wild are majestic animals which we ought to enjoy looking at them or just having them there, right? And having them in small cages where they're bred for meat is not good, is not really not really a relativistic concept. So the point I'm going to make is there have to be certain ethical judgments which you make beforehand, because there are certain things which you value for themselves, in themselves, right, which have to form the and which is the bedrock of policy, right? So that's the argument that I will make. Do you think having tigers, whether tigers ought to be in the wild or ought to be bred for bones, is it a relative concept, or do you think there is something absolute about that? No, tigers have to be in the wild, or that there ought not to be a market for kidneys. That people should not be selling kidneys on the market, right? That people should not, when you look at an individual, you should not think of an individual, you should not value an individual on the basis of the market value of his various body parts, right? That's not the right way to look at individuals. Is this an absolute judgment or a relative judgment?
It is relative here because if a person is very needy and if he doesn't have any other alternative, in practical life, it many a times it happens that people go and
It
they
happens. It happens.
yeah,
But do you think it ought to happen? Do you think, as a
no, it does
principle,
not happen actually.
no, as a principle, do you think we ought to accept that people should be allowed to, that selling kidneys is all right, and that individuals, essentially the value of an individual is simply the value of all his body parts? Is that acceptable as an idea?
No, it is not
No,
acceptable.
it is not. So obviously there is no relativeness about it. I understand in certain needy senses people can do it, right? Like I can understand A can murder B, right? When A is really driven to the point. But that does not justify the idea that murder is allowed, right?
Means
Sir, but talking about, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
individualistic approach, and we should not think it from should not generalize it.
No, but you see, the idea is if you're a policymaker, then are you fine? So it's the idea that, for example, will you have a policy where you say that people who want to sell kidneys can actually sell kidneys if they feel like, and that there can be a market for kidneys, so people can actually, that be different prices. You can just buy kidneys on the market. Do you think you're comfortable with that idea?
No, no.
No, you can't be, right? Or do you think that it is perfectly fine? I know that needy children drop out of school and start working in brick kilns. But are we fine with the idea that children can work in brick kilns? The child labor is allowed. It's perfectly fine to have child labor.
Sir, don't you think that starts a debate on the value of choice, on the value of individual choice?
So I think so. You need to, therefore, the point is that what we're trying to make is that we must have this debate, and this debate is quite critical to policy, understanding policy, right? Okay, whereas many times what we are taught by and large is that what markets do is perfectly fine, right? If you have unregulated markets, then they yield the best possible outcome. That's one extreme way of market fundamentalism. You see, many times what happens is our textbooks make things look as if there are curves and there are equations and curves shifting up and down, and we think of it as being science without the need for any ethical judgment. But there has to be a debate. That's the whole point. You need to debate these. Yeah. Yeah, but you see, Harshad, meat eating is a different thing. You can eat meat, you can not eat meat, right? But do you really? But there are some, for some people it might be repugnant, but you cannot have a general rule which says that meat is not good. But maybe having a general rule that, so you can't have a general policy that people should not eat meat or that people should eat meat, right? Okay. In fact, if you actually had a general policy that people ought not to eat meat, then that would be looked at as restrictions of freedom. But you cannot have a general policy which says that child labor is allowed. That children can simply drop out of school and start working in brick kilns or in hazardous occupations, in firecracker factories and textile mills, in foundries, and so on. So there are certain things. The whole point I'm trying to say is that there are certain things which society that as policymakers, as people who are, as individuals, as the people, policymakers who are concerned about the overall economic well-being, ought to think twice before being allowed to form markets in those.
Sir, what do you think is the economic value of freedom, and what do you think is the economic value of freedom of choice? Like,
Well, without freedom of choice, you can't have economics, no? You can't have markets, you can't have prices. So unless you have freedom of choice, you can't even have a price. So you can't think of the price of a freedom of choice, because if you don't have, that's the whole thing I'll talk about in the next class. Unless you have freedom of choice and you can choose, prices in the market don't get determined. And if prices in the market don't get determined, then you cannot have an economic value of the freedom of choice. So freedom of choice precedes economic value. Yeah. Sure. So in the next class, we'll meet to discuss the new classical model in great detail. Sure.
Sir, is it on next Sunday?
Next Sunday, every Sunday from 5 to 6, 6:15 or so. Yeah, 6:30, so on. 1.5 hours we'll sit and chat and think of ideas. So for 1 hour or so, I'll take you through the theory in the argument. 1 hour, 15 minutes, and then we can have some arguments, debates about that. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.